1953, a psychologist named Evelyn Hooker did something that sounds simple in retrospect. She gave a psychological test to two groups of men: the Rorschach, the TAT, the MAPS, standard batteries. Both groups completed the same assessments under the same conditions. The difference between the groups was this: one group was gay, one group was straight. She then gave the test results, stripped of any identifying information, to a panel of expert clinicians, trained psychologists, people who read these assessments for a living. She asked them one question: which results belong to the psychologically disturbed individuals? They couldn't tell. Not because they weren't skilled, because there was nothing to find. The gay men showed no greater psychological disturbance than the straight men. The profiles were indistinguishable. Hooker published her findings in 1957, and the field did what the field often does when confronted with evidence that challenges a comfortable assumption. It largely ignored her. Because in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association had published the very first DSM, and in that manual, homosexuality was listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance. It was a diagnosis, an illness, something to be treated, something to be cured. That was the clinical consensus, and it had enormous consequences for people diagnosed, for the families told their children were sick, for therapists who believed they were helping when they were causing harm. But Hooker's research didn't disappear, it accumulated. Other researchers built on it. Gay activists, many of them psychologists and psychiatrists themselves, began challenging the diagnosis from inside the field. A man named Frank Kemeny, who had been fired from his federal government for being gay, stood up at an APA conference in 1971 and said something that has never been said in the room before: we are experts on our own lives. 2 years later, December 15th, 1973, the APA Board of Trustees voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM. Not because the science had suddenly changed, because the science had been there for nearly 2 decades. What changed was who was allowed to define what mental health meant. I want you to hold that story for a moment before we go any further. Because it isn't just history. It's a lesson about the relationship between our field and the people we serve, about how long it takes for evidence to overcome assumption, about what happens when the people with the most at stake are finally allowed in the room. And it's a reminder that the DSM we study today, the one on the exam, is not a fixed truth. It's a field's best current understanding, which means it has been wrong before and it will continue to evolve. The question for every clinician isn't just what does the DSM say, it's what does the human being in front of you actually need. Welcome to the Lycer Lifeline podcast, the podcast that helps you build the clinical knowledge and confidence to pass your exam and show up well in the room. I'm Matt Lawson, and this week's episode is one I've been looking forward to. It's Pride Month, June, and rather than do a standard clinical content episode, I wanted to do something that lives at the intersection of where clinical practice, human dignity, and your development as a therapist all meet. Today, we're talking about the LGBTQ affirming practice, what it means, what it looks like in the room, how it shows up in your licensing exam, and what it asks of you as a future clinician. This episode is for everyone. If you identify as LGBTQ+, welcome. This one is partly about you and partly for you. If you identify as an ally, welcome. What we're covering today will make you a better clinician for some of the clients who most need your skills and affirming care. Before we get into the episode today, just a couple of announcements. Thank you for everyone that's reached out to me about the link for the online community that I've been building. The links should all be fixed. And again, that is for this Leicester Lifeline Circle community. You can try it out for 14 days for free. Just go give it a look. The link should get you into the group. I'm putting in new stuff on a pretty weekly basis. Definitely that everything that corresponds with each episode. I will be starting up the live sessions here pretty soon. I'm waiting for some more people to join to get those going. But just go take a look. It's something that I'm really hoping to build upon and make it a part of your studying experience. Also, to go along with that, I do have a newsletter that you can take a look at as well. That is free. That is meant as a companion to the podcast. So the hope is that we go over things in this podcast, and then we'll add some depth with the newsletter. Again, a really nice piece of literature to just add to your studying process to get that information out there. I also want to apologize for getting this episode out a bit late. I was spending the weekend actually up celebrating Pride with my family in Colorado, up in the mountains. If you ever get a chance to come out here for Avon Pride in the Park, it is one of the funnest Pride events that Colorado celebrates. Highly, highly recommend it. But we spent the entire weekend up in the mountains. It was a blast. Okay, let's get into the show. All right, first up in the news, a new study from the Kinsey Institute confirms what clinicians working with the LGBTQ plus populations have known for years. LGBTQ plus young people face some of the greatest mental health challenges of any group, with worse outcomes than their straight cisgender peers across depression, anxiety, and suicide risk. And those disparities persist into young adulthood. The researchers link these disparities directly to rejection, discrimination, and victimization, something we really need to keep in mind as clinicians. When people from the LGBTQ plus community come in for support, they are dealing with a society that oftentimes is rejecting them and causing their mental health issues. And, being able to be there for them and to support these individuals, as we do with all marginalized communities, is a huge, 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 huge help. It's a part of my practice to work with individuals in the LGBTQ plus community. And, I unfortunately hear very similar stories over and over and over again, regardless of where they are, either in the mountains or like down in Denver or wherever, that they're dealing with communities oftentimes that are not as supportive and accepting of them. I want you to notice that the disparities here in this report aren't caused by being LGBTQ+. They're caused by what happens to individuals that identify as LGBTQ+. People in that environment that don't feel safe. And more, I think, than ever before with the way the world is right now, I'm seeing more and more individuals in this community that are just struggling with just not feeling safe. So you can be an advocate. You can be clinically essential to these individuals' lives. Okay, next story. This Pride Month, the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention launched Pride Pathways, a new public resource specifically designed for LGBTQ plus suicide prevention, with a national presentation on June 15th and June 25th. AFSP notes that having supportive inner social circles and in communities is a protective factor against suicide for LGBTQ plus communities. That last part about communities is really important to hold on to. Supportive community is a protective factor, not a nice thing to have. Then this is something that you're going to see a lot in your practice. When we get people involved in communities that support them, that are inclusive, their outcomes become improve, right? And this goes for everyone. So many individuals I see come in and they just have very little social interaction. They don't, especially adults. So many of them just don't have regular community activity. And especially for people in the LGBTQ plus communities, helping them, supporting them in getting connected to other individuals that can support them, that can relate to them, is just going to help their outcomes. All right, let's get into the main topic today. We're going to start with the CAS model of sexual identity development. When an LGBTQ plus client walks into your office, what are they walking in with? Not just their presenting concern, their history, their relationship with with their own identity, the journey they're taking to get here, or the journey they're still in the middle of. And understanding that journey isn't just culturally competent, it's clinically necessary. Because where someone is in their own identity development shapes everything. What they need from you, what they can hear, what feels helpful and feels like a threat. In 1979, a researcher named Vivienne proposed a model of homosexual identity formation that became one of the most influential frameworks in the LGBTQ plus community, affirming practice. And while the field has evolved significantly since then, the CAS model remains the most heavily tested identity development framework on every licensure exam. Here's the model, 6 stages, and I want to give you more than just the names. So in stage 1, you have identity confusion. Something doesn't quite fit. A person begins to notice thoughts, feelings, or attractions that don't match the identity they've been assuming for themselves. The question underneath this stage is, could I be gay? What this looks like clinically: distress, denial, avoidance. The person may be actively trying to not think about what they're thinking about. They may present with anxiety, depression, or vague distress without naming a source. They may not even be consciously aware of what is driving this discomfort. What they need from you: a safe, non-judgmental space. Not pressure, not premature labeling. The therapeutic relationship needs to be sturdy enough to hold whatever emerges. This is such a significant piece here, because you have to imagine somebody coming in with thoughts that up to this point, society, that family that they grew up in potentially, it doesn't quite align with what they've been taught. And so there are a lot of questions, and they need a safe space to explore these questions and a person that can sit across from them in a non-judgmental way, and really listen to them. Stage 2, identity comparison. The question shifts from could I be to maybe I am. There's a tentative acceptance of the possibility, but it comes with a profound sense of social alienation. Everyone around me is straight. Where do I fit? What this looks like clinically is often isolation, grief, a sense of being fundamentally different from everyone the person loves. Sometimes a desperate search for information, reading, researching, looking for others who feel the same way. And everybody's experience is different. I probably, unfortunately, hear a lot more people that lean toward the side of, I wasn't raised this way. My family doesn't have these values. I'm different than them. But also every once in a while I get somebody that, is fortunately raised in a family that is extremely accepting and open and supportive of their exploration of identity. So it is like no assumptions here. We just, again, are creating space. Stage 3, identity tolerance. I'm probably gay, not fully accepted, tolerated. The person begins seeking out other LGBTQ plus people, primarily to reduce isolation, but there's still a significant gap between their public and private identity. Out to some people, not to others, living in 2 different worlds. This is another one that I've seen people really struggle with, another stage that I've seen people really struggle with. I see people come up to a certain point and, they seek out individuals, but they still have a kind of like almost alter ego where they're straight presenting, maybe in their jobs or in their homes. And it's really tough to watch sometimes, because you can see just the battle in their minds between these two places where they are holding these two different identities, and that sometimes feel like they're in opposition. In a clinical sense, you're going to see compartmentalization, relief in some context, but also exhaustion, kind of like what I was saying, right? Stage 4, identity acceptance. This is where you hope people like start to get to, right? The private identity is increasingly accepted, and the gap between public and private begins to close. The person may be coming out more broadly to friends, family, colleagues. Positive contacts with the LGBTQ plus community increases. This stage often brings significant relief, and that cannot be stated. People getting to this stage where they're able to open up a bit more, and it's kind of cool because you see individuals that maybe get involved with a community that haven't quite hit this stage, and they start to meet other people that can relate to them, and that they can relate to, and that a lot of the times gives them more confidence to open up to others, and it's really neat to see that relief that comes with this. Stage 5, this is identity pride. Something shifts in this stage. A person moves from private acceptance to public ownership. There's often anger at the system and people that are required to hide in the first place, and a strong sense of identification with the LGBTQ plus community. Us versus them, my community versus the world, and that didn't affirm me. In a clinical sense, this often looks like advocacy, visibility, sometimes conflict with family or institution. I'm saying these pieces, these clinical pieces, for what might show up in the room when you're working with an individual that is maybe going through these stages or comes to you in the midst of one of these stages. Like, these are the types of things that you'll see them talk about. And stage 6, identity synthesis. The gay or lesbian the gay or lesbian identity is no longer a defining identity. It's one part of a whole, a complex self. The us versus them framework softens. The person can hold positive views of both LGBTQ plus and some LGBTQ plus people and institutions. Identity feels integrated rather than compartmentalized. Okay, what this looks like clinically: psychological integration, less energy spent managing identity, more capacity for full engagement in relationships, work, and meaning. So what this model really shows, and what I want you to see underneath the 6 stages, the CAST model is not really a model about sexual orientation. It's a model about relationships between a person's internal experience and their social world. At every stage, the person is navigating a gap between who they know themselves to be and who the world around them assumes they are. The psychological work for each stage is about closing the gap, finding safety, finding community, finding integration. That's not unique to the LGBTQ plus community, and the identity and development that goes on there. That's the work of every marginalized identity navigating a world that wasn't built with them in mind. Which means the CAST model teaches you something about clinical work that goes far beyond the LGBTQ plus community. It teaches you to ask, what is the gap this person is navigating between their internal experience and their external world, right? This is what we're looking for. We're looking for these gaps in that, the things that don't align in a person's life. And, like this is saying, this isn't just about the LGBTQ plus community. These are for everybody that feels marginalized in a world that, isn't quite made for them. And these are a lot of the themes, these stages are a lot of the themes that are going to come up for all of these individuals. So let's talk about what an affirming practice really looks like. And let me be specific, because affirming practice is one of those terms that can sound obvious until you actually try to do it. It starts before the first session. Your intake forms, your website, your waiting room, all of it communicates something before you've said a word. Does your intake form include options for gender identity beyond male and female? Does it ask for preferred name or pronouns? Does your website use language that signals inclusivity? These aren't just nice gestures. They're clinical decisions that affect whether someone decides to come back after their first appointment. You got to get this right from the get-go. I mean, that's what this is saying. We are in the world, in the practice of creating safe spaces for people. And it's not just when they're sitting in front of us. It's showing them from the get-go, showing them from the beginning, from that first call that they make to the office. And granted, coming into the field, you're not going to have too much control over this, but you can look at practices and look at places that you want to work, and be able to say like, hey, is this a place that I want to work based on what they have going on here? So you just don't want to assume a client's sexual orientation or gender identity from their presentation or their relationships. Don't assume a client's partner is the same gender as their previous partner. Don't assume coming out is complete because a client is openly gay in one context. Assumption is not good. I should have said that more elegantly. But assumption really, again, for so many areas of the work that we do here, we don't want to make assumptions, folks. We don't. You need to get to know the person. You need to get their own words. You need to get their pronouns. You need to get how people identify, all the people that we work with. Making assumptions, I've experienced it myself early on in my career. Making assumptions never works out. I shouldn't say never. Oftentimes doesn't work out the way that we thought it was going to. I wish I could give an example. Nothing's coming to me off the top of my head. So we need to ask questions, ask gently, ask directly, and with genuine curiosity. How do you identify? What pronouns do you use? Is there anything about your identity that feels important for me to understand as we work together? These questions don't just gather information. They signal that you're a clinician who can handle the answer. All right, let's go into minority stress. Ian Meyer's minority stress model, published in 2003, now a foundational instrument in the LGBTQ plus mental health community, explains the health disparities we talked about in the news segment. LGBTQ plus people experience unique stressors that are directly related to their stigmatized social status. These include distal stressors, external events like discrimination, violence, and rejection, and proximal stressors, internal experiences like internalized homophobia, expectations of rejections, and concealment. The cumulative effects of these stressors on top of general stressors everyone experiences is what drives the mental health disparities, not identity itself. That's the stigma, right? What this means clinically, when an LGBTQ plus client presents with anxiety, depression, or trauma symptoms, the minority stress context is always relevant. The question isn't just what happened to the person, it's what it has been like for that person as they walk through the world. Some clinicians get nervous around LGBTQ plus content, afraid of saying the wrong thing, asking the wrong question, using the wrong language. That anxiety is understandable and it can get in the way. LGBTQ plus clients can feel clinicians' discomfort, and discomfort communicates you're not safe here. The goal isn't perfection. When we work with anybody, you will occasionally use the wrong pronoun, stumble over terminology, not know a reference the client makes. What matters is how you respond. A clinician who says, I used the wrong pronoun just now, thank you for your patience with me, is doing something important. You're modeling repair. They're showing that the relationship is strong enough to hold imperfection. Okay, so let's get a bit into exam strategies here. Here's how LGBTQ plus affirming practice shows up on the licensure exams. The most common exam trap A vignette describes an LGBTQ plus client presenting with depression, anxiety, or relationship concerns. One answer choice addresses the identity itself as the clinical issue. Another focuses on the presenting concern within the affirming frame. The correct answer almost always focuses on the presenting concern, not the identity. Being gay is not a diagnosis. Being trans is not a diagnosis. An LGBTQ plus client who presents with depression has depression, which may be related to minority stress, family rejection, or any number of things. The clinician's job is to explore that, not to treat the identity. The CAS model on the exams love to give you a behavioral description and ask you to identify the stage. Here's the quick guide. So stage 1, confusion, doesn't know, denying, distressed by the question. In stage 2 of the CAS model, that's comparison. Accepts the possibility, but feels alienated and alone. Stage 3, this is tolerance. Probably true, seeking community, still compartmentalizing. Stage 4, acceptance. Accepting privately, coming out more broadly, managing reactions. Stage 5 is pride. Often met with anger, advocating, strong community, identification, us versus them. Stage 6, synthesis. Integrated identity is one part of a whole self, less us versus them. The exam trap in stage identification, confusing stage 5 pride with pathology. Anger at systems that causes harm is a healthy and appropriate response. It's not a clinical concern. It's a stage. Don't choose answers that pathologize it. Then with the Myers minority stress model, know the distinction between distal and proximal stressors. Distal equals external events, discrimination, rejection, violence, microaggressions. Proximal equals internal experiences, internalized stigma, expectations of rejection, and concealment. Both are clinically relevant, both contribute to the health disparities, and both are testable. All right, let's get into some multiple choice questions. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM. Which of the following most accurately describes the primary basis for this decision? Is it A, a change in social attitudes made by the diagnosis politically unattainable? B, research, including Evelyn Hooker's landmark studies, demonstrated no inherent psychological disturbance associated with homosexuality. C, new medications made treatment for homosexuality ineffective. Or D, the Supreme Court required the APA to revise its diagnostic criteria. Answer here is going to be B, Evelyn Hooker's research, along with accumulating evidence from other researchers over nearly 2 decades, demonstrated that gay men showed no greater psychological disturbance than straight men on standard psychological assessments. Question number 2. A 19-year-old client presents to therapy with vague anxiety and difficulty concentrating. During the second session, she discloses that she has been having romantic feelings for her female roommate and is confused and distressed by this. She says, "I've never thought about girls before. I don't know what's wrong with me." According to Vivienne Cass's model of sexual identity development, this client is most likely in which stage? A, identity tolerance, B, identity comparison, C, identity confusion, or D, identity pride. The answer here is going to be C, identity confusion. The defining feature of stage 1 is the question, could I be gay? The client is experiencing distress about the possibility, not because being gay is inherently distressing, but because it doesn't match her assumed identity. She hasn't yet moved to tentative acceptance. She's still asking the question. The phrase, "I don't know what's wrong with me," is classic stage 1 presentation. Question number 3. A gay male client in therapy describes feeling exhausted from constantly evaluating whether new people in his life are safe to come out to. He monitors his speech, adjusts his behavior, and manages others' potential reactions. According to Myers' minority stress model, this experience is best understood as an example of a distal stressor, external discrimination, B, a proximal stressor, expectations of rejection and hypervigilance, C, an internalized homophobia, negative self-evaluation, or D, identity confusion, uncertainty about sexual orientation. The answer here is going to be B. Myers' minority stress model distinguishes between distal stressors, external events like discrimination and violence, and proximal stressors, internal experiences like expectations of rejection, hypervigilance, and concealment. This client isn't describing an external discriminatory event. He's describing the internal vigilance and exhaustion that comes from anticipating potential rejection. Question number 4. A therapist is working with a 24-year-old lesbian client who recently came out publicly and has become heavily involved in the LGBTQ plus advocacy. The client expresses significant anger toward her parents and religious communities for not being affirming during her teenage years. The most clinically appropriate response is to A, gently challenge the client's anger as disproportionate given that her parents were acting from their own cultural context. B, refer the client to a support group to process her anger with peers rather than in individual therapy. C, recognize the anger as a developmentally appropriate response consistent with identity pride, stage 5 of the CAS model. Or D, explore whether the client's anger is masking unresolved grief about her childhood. Answer here is going to be C. Stage 5 of the CAS model, identity pride, is characterized by anger at the system and people that required concealment, strong LGBTQ plus community identification, and us versus them framework. This is a developmentally appropriate, not pathological reaction. Option A pathologizes a healthy response to real harm. Option B is avoidant and would be experienced as rejection. And option D may have clinical merit eventually, but choosing it here treats the anger as a problem to be explained away rather than a stage to be understood. Question number 5. A pre-licensed therapist who holds conservative religious beliefs is assigned an openly gay male client. The therapist is concerned about whether she can provide affirming care while maintaining her personal values. The most ethically appropriate course of action is to A, disclose her religious beliefs to the client in the first session so he can make an informed decision about continuing. B, refer the client to another therapist because her personal values are incompatible with affirming practice. C, consult with a supervisor about how to provide competent affirming care while managing her own values and continue treatment unless the values conflict and raises to the level of clinical incompetence. Or D, proceed with the treatment without disclosing her values, personal beliefs, or relevant understandings. The answer here is going to be C. This is a nuanced ethical question. The ACA Code of Ethics prohibits referral based solely on clinical personal values when referrals would harm the client. And in this case, the client hasn't presented any concerns related to his sexual orientation. The most appropriate response is supervision and consultation. That is going, I'm telling you right now, that is going to be the answer to so many of these questions on the test. It's going to come down to just go talk to your supervisor and get some consultation. The therapist can hold personal religious beliefs and still provide affirming care. The two are not inherently incompatible. Got it? All right. Okay, before we conclude today, I want to speak directly to you for a moment. If you identify as LGBTQ+, you may have listened to this episode with a particular kind of attention, because this isn't just clinical content for you. It's the story of a field that once called you disordered, that used the tools of psychology to cause harm to people like you. and that has spent the last 50 years trying to reckon with that. You're entering a field at a complicated moment. The science is clear. Affirming practice is evidence-based practice, but the political and cultural landscape around LGBTQ plus identities is charged in ways that will sometimes make your work harder. You may encounter supervisors, colleagues, institutions whose views don't align with affirming care. You may be asked to navigate that tension before you feel equipped to. You are not obligated to remain silent in those spaces. You are also not obligated to martyr yourself. This is a long game. Find your people and build your community, and remember that being a clinician who affirms LGBTQ plus clients is not a political position. It is an evidence-based clinical stance. If you identify as an ally, thank you for showing up for this episode. What we've covered today will make you a better clinician for some of the clients who most need skilled, thoughtful care. And here's what I want you to know. The work of becoming an affirming clinician isn't completed when you learn the CAS model or memorizing the APA guidelines. It is completed in the room, one relationship at a time, when a client who has been told by the world that they are wrong or broken or disordered sits across from you and experiences something different. That's the work, and it matters more than you know. And that's going to be it, folks. Happy Pride Month. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. LGBTQ plus or allied, or somewhere beautifully in between. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're becoming the kind of therapist who shows up for all of this. We need you. And, take a look again for the newsletter. Please pass this podcast along. If you are finding this beneficial, somebody else might find this beneficial as well. Let's grow the community. And, if this can help out somebody else to become an amazing therapist, yes, let's do that. Reach out to me through licenserlifeline@gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, you want me to, there's a topic you want me to cover, just shoot me an email. But until next time, everyone, never stop learning.